Shalom and welcome to Contextual Bible Study. My name is Denny Thompson. Today, session number 35 is on the Zealots. Now you might be wondering, why am I taking an entire section on the Zealots? We're going to find that they're a really significant movement in Jesus' time, especially in the Galilee and among the disciples. Now we know of Simon the Zealot, but there's much more influence than just him among the disciples. And we'll get into that. We'll look at the background and see this movement throughout Israel during this first century, in particular the Galilee region. Kind of looking into the background, because we have to start there to understand anything. If we go back to Herod the Great, now he ruled from 37 BC to 4 BC. And he ruled really the whole region except for Syria, pretty much the whole region except for Syria during his time period. But when he died, Israel was divided up into different parts among his kids, his boys. And the three of them are Archelaus, you can see down in the center, which would be the area of Judea and part of Samaria, part of Upper Israel. Philip in the upper right, and Antipas. Antipas is over by the Sea of Galilee. Those are the three sons. Well, one of those three, Archelaus, didn't last long. He was a horrible leader. And the Roman government decided to turn that into a whole other setup. Rather than having one of the other sons rule it, they set up governors. The most famous is Pontius Pilate, one you've heard about. All right, so Herod Antipas took over in 4 BC. We're centering right now up by the Sea of Galilee, up where he is, his location, Herod Antipas. And he ruled all the way to 39 AD, so quite a while. And there he is, okay, in the purple area. That's his region, this very significant area where the events of the New Testament, many of them are. And, of course, that's the Sea of Galilee, so he surrounded it. Now, the administrative center for Herod the Great, okay, when Herod the Great was living, became also the headquarters of Herod Antipas. Now, you can see where the town called Sepphoris is, the yellow dot. It's just above Nazareth, just barely above Nazareth. That actually was kind of like the center of this Galilee region that Herod the Great set up, and then his son took over using the same area. All right. Now, this is from that Bible Stock, a new source that I found. It's kind of neat. We're zooming in over the city of Nazareth today, and you can see this winding road going up to Sepphoris, which is about 5 or 6 miles. It's very likely Jesus and his father, Joseph, very likely worked here at some point. That's another story. So this is the ruins of this area. This is a very prominent town. This was the headquarters of Herod the Great and then Herod Antipas at first in this region. Very wealthy, a lot of money here. A lot of the Roman money came into this town because it's kind of like the headquarters. It's the governing center. And what you're looking at in pictures right here are some of the floors of the very, very wealthy homes. You can see these mosaic designs were really quite something. You can see them today, actually. Here's just a few examples of them. This one's the most famous. It's called the Mona Lisa of Sepphoris, or of the Galilee region. Kind of looks like the Mona Lisa. Here's the ancient Cardo of Sepphoris. You can see very clearly the Cardo is the main street, remember? You can even see a few of the pillars left. So clearly this is a very, very significant town. And all Roman towns had these theaters. There were many major building projects in Sepphoris during the time Jesus was growing up in Nazareth, just 4 miles south of Sepphoris, 4 to 5 miles. And it's interesting that possibly Jesus and Joseph might have worked here. We don't know that for sure, but there's a chance. One clue would be that Jesus used the term hypocrite. Okay, it's actually from a Greek term, Hippocrates, which simply means actor or one who pretends. Okay, so that's what that means. And that was a theater term. So he possibly picked that up there. We don't know that for certain, but there's some evidence to indicate that very likely they could have spent time there working. Now, in Sepphoris, during the time a young Herod the Great was governor, okay, of the Galilee. Now, this is at his beginning time, going back to Herod the Great again. There was a guy named Hezekiah the Zealot. He led a band of a group called Zealots. And the Hebrew word is kinah, which he started a guerrilla war against the Romans. Now, Herod eventually caught him, took him prisoner, and beheaded him without a trial. He also killed many Zealot followers of Hezekiah to gain favor with Rome. So he wanted to stop any of these insurrections. And there was a group back then called the Zealots who were showing up, and they hated Rome. And now this Hebrew word, kinah, means zeal, jealousy, or envy. Okay, so we're kind of using the primary meaning zeal to get this idea of zealous or zealots. That's kind of where this word came from. And this brutal ending to Hezekiah to stop this movement did not end the movement, though, because many of the survivors went to Mount Arbel, which we'll look at that in a second, next to the Sea of Galilee, and hid in numerous caves. So even though Herod the Great, way back then, stopped this guy, Hezekiah, he didn't stop the movement. So this is where the area that they went to, these cliffs. Tiberias, you can see, is in the distance. This is really the only city on the Sea of Galilee today. It became later the Roman headquarters, where that arrow's pointing, and you can see these cliffs. So they actually went to these cliffs. Let's look at it closer. And they hid in caves. Look at all the caves in the cliffs. They were fleeing Herod the Great's oppression and his brutality, as well as refusing to pay taxes. They never were going to pay taxes to Rome. So they hid in these caves to get away from Herod's forces. Now the Zealots refused to pay taxes and be loyal to Rome, whom they called thieves. They referred to the Romans as thieves. The Roman money, denarius, literally had engraved right on it, Caesar is Lord. And that's not something the Zealots were going to have any part of. The Zealots were very devout followers of God. Okay. Now we picture them as maybe somewhat violent, and at times they were, but they were devout followers of God. And it goes back to this idea in terms of the paying taxes to Rome and money and that kind of thing. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. And they consider this to be an image. And of course, that printed on the coin made it even that much worse. Under no condition will we ever compromise our obedience to God, no taxes to Rome. That's what they thought, and they held to their convictions. The Zealots might have been the reason, after performing miracles, Jesus often said, don't tell anybody, because this movement was very big in the Galilee, and very possibly he did not want to start a military campaign. So that might have been a reason he often said that, which he did. So Herod ordered his forces to go after these people that hid in these cliffs, and these caves in the cliffs. All right, and what they did is they lit fires to try to force families out. The soldiers made platforms, and they lowered themselves from the top of the cliff to get down into the cave area. And they not only lit fires, they used hooks with big long poles to literally try to grab the people and throw them out to their death. So this is just pure brutality and horrific, how these zealots were treated. Even though all this happened, they never stopped. The picture on the right is kind of a recreation of what it might have looked like. Just horrible, horrible. Now, the survivors, many of them who survived all of this, fled to a place called Gamla, right there. Now, that's going to be very, very important. The picture on the very first title page is from there, and we'll see that further in a minute. So many of them went over here. Not all of them, but this became the headquarters over here. Many of them are scattered all throughout Galilee. So you can see Gamla in red, and you can see the Golanitis is the Golan region up there, the whole Golan Heights we call it today. And then the Decapolis was down below, the whole story of Legion, the feeding of the 4,000, that whole thing. Okay? So this is Gamla, and this is what it looks like. It's quite interesting. And that's the Sea of Galilee way down low in the distance there. So it looks like this, and we're going to look at it closer, quite a bit closer in just a minute. Now, back to Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. He's going to move the capital from this incredible town called Sepphoris, all these Roman ruins are these beautiful buildings, mosaics, theaters, you name it, to Tiberias. In 19 AD is when he did this. He moved it over here. He built a city. He actually built it over a graveyard, Jewish graveyard, stupidly, to insult the Jews, but he did it anyway. But he not only insulted the Jews in that respect, but also because he built it right at the very, very close to where his father had executed and tortured all these Jewish zealots. Okay? And during the time of Emperor Tiberius is when this took place. You can see the dates of Tiberius, and that fell, 19, of course, fell during that time period. And he did it right next to where his father had slaughtered these zealots' relatives. And they all knew the story. All this is well known, what had happened in the past. Okay? Right here is where it took place. Just beyond Tiberias, in those cliffs, in those caves. Like this, we saw a little bit ago. All right. Now, many wonder, where does Rabbi Jesus stand on the Zealot movement back in that time period? They wonder, where does he stand? Well, if we look at the names of the disciples, okay, you can see the entire list here. I want you to just focus on this one. We had a tax collector, because this was right on that Via Maris, and that's where the tax stands were, named Matthew, as you know. And then we had Simon the Zealot. Now, this was he was an actual zealot. And even though we'll see in a minute, many others had zealot influences, many other disciples, quite a bit, but Simon the Zealot was literally one of the zealots. Now, to have two different people like that on his group of 12, his disciples, Jesus apparently was making a point, because the zealots despise the tax collectors. Remember, they viewed them as just absolutely evil, because they use these coins and they're forcing to pay taxes, and they refuse. So we have two incredibly different, from two different worlds together on the 12 disciples. Truly amazing. So was he making a point? Well, probably a lot of points like this. Love your enemies. It's interesting. I don't know the whole thing, but I mean, we can kind of speculate. Why would he do this? Well, he obviously saw worth in both of them, but I think it's pretty fascinating that he did do this. All right, so let's go back to this map, and I've drawn a line right at the upper part of the Decapolis. Remember, that was called the land of the 7. And up here, the land of the 12 is that devout Jewish section up here. And the Zealots live primarily over there to the upper right. And you can see Gamla was literally their headquarters, but they lived throughout this region. Now, notice something. Notice Bethsaida, okay, very, very important town in this first century world, a fishing village, important also because Jesus had many disciples from there, was right in this area, just below Gamla. It's down by the Sea of Galilee at the mouth of the Jordan River, but it's not so far. It's in this zealot, very highly influenced region. And there's Gamla, and there's Bethsaida. All right, so let's look on this map. Now, Gamla is a little bit further up the hill, because it is up on the ridge there, overlooking down on the Sea of Galilee. And again, this is a zealot headquarters. But this whole region, all the way to the Jordan River, is highly zealot influenced. More so than any part of the Galilee. And that would include going down to Bethsaida. Now, the reason that arrow's pointing there's two Bethsaidas. There's really only one, but they're trying to determine which one was the one of first century Israel. Very likely it's that one, El Araj. okay, for all kinds of reasons. I won't go into right now, but so right there. The important part is this area is very heavily zealot influenced, and that's important to remember when we look at the disciples and some of the incidents that happened. Now, we know that Peter, Andrew, James and John, and Philip are all from Bethsaida. The scriptures tell us that. Now, it's possible that Simon the Zealot lived in Gamla. We don't know that for sure. It's also possible he lived in Cana. So that's another possibility. Some people believe that might be true. I don't think we know for sure. But the important thing is that Bethsaida is massively, it's right by Gamla. It's in the Zealot region, and we had so many disciples from there. Now, this another location where there were many zealots, and I mentioned that this could have been the hometown of Simon the Zealot. It's a little bit unclear. The biblical location where Jesus performed his first miracle of turning water into wine at that wedding. Historically, it's associated with the Zealots also. Okay, and it's likely or possible Simon was born there, even though we're not sure. But we do know that Nathanael is from Cana and spent a lot of time in Bethsaida. So clearly, if we kind of add him in the mix, because he spends a lot of time in Bethsaida, he's going to be highly influenced by what's happening in this zealot influence region too. Now, some Bible scholars believe, this is not for certain, but there's a thought process that this might be true, that Judas Iscariot, now his name Judas, of course, but Iscariot is kind of like a title. Is translated from the word Ish, which means man, and Keriot is a town in Judah, south of Jerusalem. You can see on the map right there. All right, so he's from that town. He's a man from Keriot, and there is some evidence possibly that was the only the only zealot stronghold in Judah or Judea. Okay, the only one. And it's interesting that Matthew lists Judas Iscariot last, right after Simon the Zealot. Okay, so the Zealots, all right, of course, from the Hebrew word kinah, which means zeal, jealousy, or envy. The question I want to look at right now is, was this an admirable quality to God? Did he honor this? So we need to go back in history. We need to go back because we always have to understand all these things. So the very first example listed in the scriptures is a commandment. This one. The first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven, above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. Remember, that was a significant thing with the Zealots and the whole idea of coins. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous is translated here, God, kinah, jealous or zealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. The next example, another example, would be in Numbers 25. Okay, this, to kind of set the stage, this is when the Israelites have left Egypt and they've been wandering for 40 years and they're coming up to Mount Nebo. And right close to that is this town called Shittim. And while Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women who invited them to the sacrifices of their God. And there are also Midianites in this area too, because we know that from this text. Then an Israelite man brought into the camp a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. In other words, right in front of the tabernacle. The Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in the broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel. So Moses said to Israel's judges, each of you must put to death those of your people who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor. So we had all this going on, how these Israelite men who had been doing this, and then we had this individual person who actually took a Midianite woman right in front of the tabernacle. And going back to that, in that particular instance, when Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into the tent. He drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's stomach. The plague against the Israelites was stopped. This man having sexual relations with this woman literally right in front of the tabernacle. And this is what God commanded. And Phinehas did exactly what God said for him to do. Now, when Aaron died, he appointed Eleazar as high priest, who then appointed his son Phinehas to replace him. All right, because this is what God said, and this is in relationship to this incident. The Lord said to Moses, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned my anger away from the Israelites, since he was as zealous for my honor among them as I am. I did not put an end to them in my zeal. Therefore, tell him I am making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of lasting priesthood because he was zealous for the honor of God and made atonement for the Israelites. Okay, this is really fascinating because he was obedient and he did this, even though what he did was, obviously pretty harsh, but God commanded this for them to die because they had so profaned his name in front of the entire assembly. He made him the line of the priesthood because of his obedience. He followed it through because this relationship back to Aaron, but because of his obedience. This is exactly how God reacted, because he was zealous. All right, this covenant of lasting priesthood, which is very, very, very important. Now, another incident, okay? And this was with James and John, if you remember when they were going through Samaria one time. And this is kind of hearkening back to Elijah, this whole idea of what they are asking. They're in Samaria in the early time period. And if we go back to 1 Kings 18, all right, that's where that took place. And that's the incident with Elijah, where he commanded, or he called God to send down fire and to light up the sacrifice, and then he killed the priests of the pagan priests of Baal and Asherah. All right, but to this incident, this New Testament incident, which is really hearkening back to that. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was headed for Jerusalem. When the disciples and John saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them? But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went to another village. Okay, so that's really what they're hearkening back to here. And of course, they were from Bethsaida. So they had grown up in this zealot influence region, and this whole story of Elijah's obedience and how he gone against the prophet of Baal and Asherah was a very, very well-known story. So in their thinking, they're thinking very the same thing. And this was that incident going back into the Old Testament, this very, very important incident of Elijah obeying God. And God provided the fire to consume the sacrifice even after water was poured on it, to show the pagan prophets that he is God, not the prophets of Baal and Asherah, the false gods. No, he is. And he showed it by this incident. Another example was in Hanukkah, when the temple was taken over by the Syrians and they really profaned it. They sacrificed a pig on the altar. I mentioned this before, but just to very briefly mention it, that type of thing, and they just defamed the whole temple area. When Mattathias saw it, now he was a Jewish man who saw it, and he burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and slaughtered him at the altar. This is the man who sacrificed a pig and done all these various things to defame the temple. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing him to sacrifice. And he tore down the altar. Then he burned with zeal for the law, just as Phinehas did against Zimri, son of Salu. Now, this is not in the Bible. This is in Maccabees. It's not in the Bible that we have, but it's a well-documented incident. So here we go again, kind of following through this whole idea of zeal, zealousness. And that ended by the high priest being able to light the menorah again, and it burned for 8 days, even though there was enough oil only for 1 day. Very fascinating story. Jesus taught at Hanukkah also, and it's normally was held in December during the coldest month of the year, or second coldest month. Now, then Paul the Zealot, in Philippians 3:6, as for zeal, persecuting the church, or as for righteousness based on the law, faultless. After Stephen's speech, okay, this goes back. Paul was there to help kill Christians, and he was going to observe Stephen and what happened to him. It was going to have a gigantic influence on him. At this, they covered their ears and, yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul, who later became Paul. All right. Now, then in Acts 8, this happened a little bit later, but God was working through him from what he saw at that particular martyring of Stephen. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Then he fell on his knees and cried out, Lord, do not hold the sin against him. When he had said this, he fell asleep. What an influence this had on him. And Saul, pretty soon after that, continuing what he was doing, began to destroy the church, going from house to house. He dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. And these new followers of Jesus certainly knew this. But on the way to Damascus to arrest more of them from the way, that's what this original group was called, the followers of Jesus, then, okay, as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? All right. Now, Jesus needed zealous people, passionate, but not violent. All right. So there's such a history to this. It's really something. And going back to the original commandment, there is a definite history to this. Even Jesus himself, this incident we've mentioned before, but when he entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling, he overturned the tables of money changers and benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise to the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, Is it not written, my house will be called the house of prayer for all nations? And of course, all nations meant the Gentiles too, but you've made it a den of robbers, quoting Jeremiah 7. Now, the disciples would certainly have remembered the following verse because they're so biblically literate. For zeal, your house consumes me, and the insult of those who insult you fall on me. So they would have probably, that verse would have been running through their minds as they saw Jesus doing this. All right. Now, the group of people in Jesus' time period, many of them are called Sicarii. Many of the Zealots, I should say, were called Sicarii. Not all of them were, but the ones who carried a small little blade called a sicar. And then it was the Sicarii, as they were called, who were robbers. Now, robbers could also be translated from this word kina, the Zealots. Okay, that's going to be significant when we get to that. We're going to finish this lesson with a cross, somebody on the cross who was labeled as a robber. When they grew numerous, they made use of small swords. Actually, they're like little knives. And from these weapons, these robbers got their denomination. And with these weapons, they slew a great many. This is a direct quote from Josephus, and there's that little weapon right there. It's called a sicar. And they could hide that in their cloak, and they could pull that out and kill a Roman. Go right up behind them and kill a Roman soldier really quick. So the Sicarii were hated by the Romans, to say the least. They were zealots, but not all zealots did what the Sicarii did. Some did. So back up here to Gamla. Let's go back up here again, right there. All right, this is the headquarters of the Zealots. This is town. It's a fascinating place. It's such an unusual area. The Zealots were in almost every Galilean town, but this was their headquarters. And Gamla actually means camel, like the hump of a camel. And you can see it's kind of shaped that way. Here you can see it better. It's camel in Aramaic, become the home to many Jews returning from Babylon in 150 BC, and later become, soon after that, the head of the Zealots. Okay, now we're going to look at this closer because a lot happened here and it's very significant. The summit is up there. There you can see a round tower where I'm pointing to, kind of a tower that they could use to watch out for the Roman soldiers because they are always under threat of Rome. The Roman soldiers want to kill these guys more than anybody. You can see the city wall, what's left of it today. There's a breach in the wall where a massive battle took place, and a very important building, a synagogue, right there. Because these are very, very devout people. This place called Gamla. 5,000 people built their homes on the south slope. That's to the left here. The north slope was a very steep cliff. If you look to the right side, the north slope, that would be the north, was very steep. One man's roof was the front yard of another. So if we look at this is a picture I took from Gamla. I've been here a few times. These homes were built literally right into each other, and one roof went into another because it's so incredibly steep. It's hard to imagine living in a place like this, but even just to walk there is incredibly difficult. Okay, we're going to watch a little video from Preserving Bible Times, a source I'd used before. I'll take it from a helicopter to get a good aerial view of what Gamla looks like. There's some
in the
very
time
good
of
information
Jesus,
in this
Lower
video.
Golan, part of which is seen here, was named Galanitis and highly Hellenized. Most Jews were not observant of the law of Moses. An exception was those who lived here, at Gamla. Shaped like a camel's hump, the city was built on this ridge, just above the plain of Bethsaida. The Jewish historian Josephus records that the city was instrumental in the revolt against Rome in AD 66 to 70. Gamla is sometimes referred to as the Masada of the North, since it held out against Rome very much as the more famous Masada did at the very end of the revolt. Rather than be captured as the Romans made the final assault on the city in AD 67, Josephus reported that thousands of Jewish men, women, and children leaped to their death from the peak of this ridge.
All right, that does a really good job of kind of the overview of what it looks like. Now, this is a second video. This is another one from this newer source that I have called Bible Stock. So let's look at this, and we're going to look at the area a little bit closer as we kind of zoom in from a distance. So here we go. Okay, now you can see the camera kind of zooming around over the Sea of Galilee, going up the hill. You can see the Jordan River to the right of Capernaum. That's where that is. Bethsaida is right there, but right up there. And now we can see that camel-looking Gamla. And there it is. We saw it in a previous video, but we're looking through this one. That right side is incredibly so rugged. Nobody could live there. They lived on the left side. Even that was amazing. That picture I took, of course, was just diagrams that you see on these archaeology sites in Israel. I always like to take pictures of those because those are hard to find. The up to the right is where you actually park if you go to the national park, and you can climb down this rock cliff to the far right here. And as you get to the bottom, that's where the Romans camped, and that's where they're going after Gamla in a massive battle. They also have a setup for buses that can drive down to the bottom there, so somebody doesn't have to climb that cliff going down. That's a little bit much. This is extremely rugged land. This video kind of zooms in on this wall, what's left of it, and right on the inside is the most important town, or I should say building in Gamla, and it's obviously the synagogue. This is a center of life. This is kind of neat. You can see walking up to it, just to get an idea of the geography, how steep this is. These people had to be in incredible shape, walking up and down all day to go get their food and water, bring it up here. and didn't worry about being attacked by the Romans on this cliff where they actually lived. So we're kind of moving into the synagogue itself. We'll look at a little diagram, what it looked like, but this is an ancient synagogue. And it's likely, we don't know for certain, but based on the scriptures, that Jesus was here at one point. And here it is. It's wall preserved, obviously of the ruins of it, but wall preserved. That area in the center is called the Bema, the center of it. The speaker would stand on that, where this gentleman is, just to his right. And now we're kind of zooming back out again. You can see the city wall. And we're going to talk in just a minute about how the Romans just broke through that wall and destroyed this place, Gamla, because they hated it. They just despised what these people stood for. They did not like the Zealots. Now, this Gamla synagogue is the oldest one ever found. Now, they date it to 100 BC, okay, obviously before the time of Jesus. So now that we know from the scriptures that Jesus went through all the towns and villages teaching in their synagogues. So we could kind of surmise from that he was here at one point. Okay, a little closer view again we saw from previously. These are the pillar stands are where long, big, tall pillars stood, and there was a roof on it. And this, by the way, is a mikvah that they had to purify themselves with a type of water called living water to be cleansed, okay, for various ceremonies. And this is probably what the synagogue would have looked like. It had these pillars, and it would have had little seating areas kind of like tiered in that area there. The little lights in the top of the windows are the only lights there are that would let through the light of the sunlight. Okay, and that would be it. So this is probably what a typical synagogue would look like. And to your left, those are mikvot is plural, or mikvah. That's where people got purified using living water. Kind of a precursor of baptism in a sense. This picture is from Gamla itself that I took there. And they're kind of drawing what they believe that synagogue actually looked like back then, with the zealots attending services. Pretty fascinating. Gamla destroyed about 40 years after Jesus' time period, and it was never rebuilt. Never. It still sits exactly as it was after it was destroyed. All right, now we're going to look more into this. See where it says breach. Okay, the Roman soldiers are going to be attacking this town because they wanted these people dead. Many of them had used these little blades. Many of these were sicaries, which would kill Roman soldiers, and obviously they wanted them gone. So that breach is actually where the Roman soldiers got through. And this is a little bit of a closer up view of it. After an incredibly aggressive battle, just a vicious battle right there, right in that area. And again, you can see synagogue just beyond we looked at. This is also from Gamla. I took this picture. They recreated it. You can see that tower on the right, kind of that watchtower, and that big cliff on to the right going down, and the buildings in the town on the left with a tall wall. Not much taller, obviously, than what remains of it today. It was a big protected wall. And here comes the Roman soldiers in early 67 AD, so we're a few years later now. The city's going to stand that long. A Roman army led by Agrippa failed in its attempt to take Gamla. The Zealots from all over Galilee were crowded here, and many more even came here to this place for security. Then, a little bit later, a few months later, Vespasian, who later is going to become the emperor of Rome, led 30,000 Roman soldiers. That's amazing. It took that many. 3 legions. Most anywhere in the world. This is a massive, massive army, and surrounded Gamla. Do you imagine? They devoted that many resources just to take these people out and to wipe this town out. After a vicious battle, Vespasian's troops breached the walls right here. And this is kind of a recreation of what it might have looked like. They used these instruments, these battering rams to hit the walls, and many other instruments to try to kill the people. They use, we'll look at a couple of samples here in a second. But it was just an absolutely brutal, brutal battle. And the Zealots would not give up. They fought to their death. An incredibly bloody battle. There were more arrowheads and cannonballs found here than any place else in all of Israel. That's how big of a battle it was. Now, this picture kind of gives the idea that what the Zealots were fighting with versus what the Romans were fighting with. And yet they fought incredibly valiantly. They simply would not give up. It wasn't in their DNA. This is one of the instruments the Romans actually used. It's still there today. You can actually look at it. It was used to launch actually stones. Not really actually cannonballs, but kind of like small stones that they would use, and they were deadly. It was kind of a lever type setup. They could get one in there and pull it back and release it. Right here, these are the stones they launched. Now, these are deadly if they're moving at fast speed. And these are some of the actual stones found in the area, the actual ones the Romans launched in those machines. So this battle was incredible. So this is just part of a very detailed account that the historian Josephus wrote about in terms of this Battle of Gamla. Okay, the news of the incursion rapidly spreading to the interior of the town. Some, snatching up their children and dragging their wives after them, fled with their wailing and weeping families up to that citadel, that round tower. Those who faced Vespasian were incessantly dropping. Of course, Vespasian and his massive army, while any who were debarred from escape to the heights fell in their bewilderment into the hands of the Roman sentries. This is kind of an unusual way of saying they were killed in battle. On all sides was heard the never-ending moan of dying, and the whole city was deluged with blood pouring down the slopes. Horrible, absolutely horrific battle. Terrible battle. Now, with nowhere to go, up to 5,000 of these people committed suicide. They went to the end of the Gamla cliff, and what we're looking at right here is the end of the cliff, and they jumped to their death right off this cliff. Now, I walked all the way out here to try to get a good picture. I almost quit a couple times because it's so steep and it's so hard to get out here, but from this area right out here is where these people committed suicide rather than letting the Romans kill them. Now, I got a little bit closer to the edge of the cliff. This is as close as I was going to get. Right here is where I believe they jumped. It's just straight down to their deaths. Rather than, now the same thing is going to happen in a place called Masada. There's going to be this suicide pact rather than letting the Roman soldiers kill them. So this right here was a very dark moment in Israel's history. Right what you're looking at right there. An amazing, awful historical incident. Although not a Gamla, somebody named Eleazar ben Yair was a leader in a Galilee revolt against Rome. Now, he's obviously a zealot. In 66 AD, he, along with like-minded followers, went to Masada near the Dead Sea. He was joined by many others from other zealot strongholds. So in other words, after Gamla fell, there were still zealots in the area. A lot of them were killed. This was a devastating to this incident, to the zealous movement, but some were left. And this guy is going to lead kind of like a final battle that we're not going to talk about today, but probably another time, in a place called Masada. And I'm just going to show you where it is, where the zealots eventually gathered down here at Masada. And this is what it looks like. In 70 AD is when a final battle of the zealots is going to take place down here. And this is just a very quick little view of it from Bible stock. Not in any depth at all. I just want you to see it. This is a zealot battle. It's going to be the final battle of any battle in Israel. It's actually going to be 73 AD when it's over. And you can see up here in this cliff, and I'm not going to go into any depth here because we'll look at it in a future date because it's an amazing part of Israel's history. So this is a story of the Zealots too. It was the final story. It happened a few years, not too long after what happened at Gamla. There are massive storehouses filled with food. Really, really quite the story. And you can kind of see a few of the elements right here. Now, this was actually where the Roman soldiers are going to go up to eventually force them into giving up and committing suicide also, Masada. And these are some of the actual lots that they drew to commit suicide. And there's a whole story behind that, but not going into it today. Now, the Zealots and the events of Passover. Okay? So, Passover or Easter, when Jesus entered a town on Lamb Selection Day, okay, that day, when he came in, among the crowd were champions of the common people. The Zealots were considered to be somebody that the common people really liked because they stood up for him in a completely amazing way, because they would die to protect the other people, to protect the Jewish life. They believed that they had to do this, to bring these little sikars, these little knives with them, and they could come up behind a Roman soldier. There were even accounts of how they could kill them, obviously, reach underneath their armor. But there were accounts of how some of them could go underneath their armor and literally cut their heart out and throw it on the ground. So this happened at Passover. This is amazing. These zealots were all over the place on the Mount of Olives as Jesus entered. And when they're waving these palm branches, they said, Hosanna to the Son of David. They're saying, "O Lord, save us." And a lot of what's going on here is they're calling out, to the Zealots, strike now. And they're calling out to Jesus, strike now. Let's get rid of these Romans. So this wasn't like they're calling for an insurrection, what they're really calling for. Now, if you think about this incident with Peter, Simon Peter, which happened right before Jesus was crucified, then Simon Peter, who had a sword, it's translated as sword, but it's likely a very small sword, probably a sikar, drew it and struck the high priest's servants, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Now, Malchus likely was in line for the priesthood, and it's very highly likely that that's what he had in his hand. Jesus' response, Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup my Father has given me?" So in other words, he has a mission to do. And Peter was having so much difficulty trying to even understand what's going on here. He thought he needed to do something. And what he thought he needed to do was probably something he had seen in the past. He understood. It's maybe even something God wanted. So, of course, Peter was from Bethsaida, which is near Gamla. So that whole idea in his background. Now, why was he cutting off the ear of Malchus? Well, it goes back to this verse right here. For the generations to come, none of your descendants who has a defect may come near to offer the food of his God. No man who has any defect may come near. No man who is blind or lame, disfigured, or deformed. So what likely Peter was doing by cutting his ear off is he was showing that this Malchus could never be a priest. He's going to be invalidated because of what he's doing, arresting Jesus. So likely that's probably what he's doing at that moment. And if you think about it, on the cross, the scriptures tell us that two rebels, the Greek word is lustus, were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Lustus means thief, robber, or rebel, insurrectionist. Okay? Now, being a robber is not actually a crucifiable offense in Israel. So that's probably not what they were. Highly unlikely, because they didn't crucify for that. But they did crucify for being a zealot, as you already know. The Hebrew word that from the Greek translation lustus could be also translated as zealot. So it's highly likely, very probable, these were zealots. They weren't just robbers. They were actual zealots who probably had carried these blades around, and who knows what they'd done. And the Romans wanted them dead. But one of them, remember the one encounter with the one who turned to Jesus and said, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom?" Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you'll be with me in paradise." Amazing encounter right there. But just to kind of think about that, that's probably who was on either side of Jesus. And one of them, from whatever he saw Jesus doing or heard him teaching, we don't know, said this: "And one day we'll meet him in heaven." I'm certain of it. It's amazing. So, one of the things just briefly at the end of each teaching I like to do, because somebody suggested it, actually it's a very good suggestion, is just kind of make a final application. I try to kind of have applications throughout the teaching. You can kind of draw from as we're going along, but just to kind of point something out at the end here. There are 35 Bible verses at least about being zealous. So the whole idea of zealot, the whole theme of today. Paul said, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. This is a big theme in the scriptures, but very much have to make the distinction between a violent zealot with a sicar is not what Paul's talking about and is not what Jesus is talking about clearly. But what they are talking about is this boldness, not to just sit back and watch what's going on. There's so much going on today, even the assault on the church, the assault on the Bible, and many people kind of falling down to accepting some of these false teachings, unfortunately. But the application I want to make on this story today is as follows, and I'm making it to myself because I tend to be one who doesn't want to make waves, who just kind of wants to, move along and not, confront somebody, and that's not good. In the right way, they need to be confronted. I believe very clearly from all of this that God honors zealousness very clearly, standing up for Him, standing up for His Word, standing up for the Scriptures all the time. It's very, very important to do that. And we may suffer because of it. We may be persecuted. Jesus said that. He said that clearly. But we need to do that. And just kind of as a thought, I was recently reading the book about Bonhoeffer. And in that book, it mentions that 80% of the Lutheran Church in Germany did not stand up to Hitler. They compromised. And they were allowed to keep their churches because they compromised to Hitler. Only 20% stood up to him and were zealous and said, no, we are going to teach about Jesus. We're going to teach the Word, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to stay with it. If the other churches would have followed suit, I think it's highly unlikely that there would have been a World War II. All these people would have died, that Hitler and the Nazis, because he would probably not have gotten power. But there's so many examples like that where we do need to stand up. And I think it's so very, very clear. And I think that's an application that we can very clearly make from this teaching about the Zealots, because so many of the disciples had this influence, as you know. All right, so that concludes today's teaching. We'll take one more look at this Gamla, which is, if you ever go to Israel, you have to go see this place. It's amazing. It's really incredible. Just walking here is incredible. All right. And again, my wish for you, in spite of all the things that there are and difficulties of life and whatever it is you're facing, that you may have the ultimate shalom that only Jesus gives. Shalom.